Arlvin stalked down the halls, an anger gnawing at his chest. Those damn Manu, this time they'd gone too far and left evidence. Of course, they would deny this as another rogue vessel, but at least this time he had the satisfaction of knowing that the Manu responsible for this were actually the ones put to death for it. A small victory, but at this moment, he'd take any victory he could get. This was certainly a situation that they hadn't ever been trained for, and one that lent itself to a major loophole. A loophole that threatened to turn the galaxy as they knew it into a nest of chaos. Such has usually been the case when a species is introduced to technology far beyond their current level of progression. The Manu would allegedly send out scouting ships to planets with sapient species that may be nearing FTL capabilities. They allegedly then perform many experiments that Garlvin frankly didn't want to think about, so they would then have the cutting edge on everything from the best gadgets tools to market specifically for them, to physiological weaknesses needed to exploit them, should they prove to be a threat. Well, this time they took a bite out of something before ensuring that it couldn't bite them back, and that's what it apparently did. As the chief of the space station security detail, Garlvin was responsible for dealing with the mess that those gray, empathy-deprived bastards had dropped so heavily in his lap. The Garito ship that had hailed the station reported having come across a Manu ship drifting lifelessly in the void. When hailed, no response was ever given, though a single life form was detected in the scans, so the ship security team of 8 boarded the derelict and found a massacre. Manu blood was sprayed all over, obviously a few days old, having dried up long ago, with impact marks all over the ship, as if some hulking beast went on a rampage, too bulky to easily fit through the narrow halls made for the diminutive creatures, who stood at a paltry 3 feet tall. The halls topped out at 4 feet, meaning the 8-foot-tall Garito were going through on all fours. Luckily they were built for either bi or quadrupedal locomotion. The security team cleared the ship, noting the destruction and the readings that the jump core was dangerously close to a meltdown. They were just getting ready to salvage what could be found when a general alert went out through the team. The survivor had been found. What had been found, nobody knew, and for a few moments, even the imminent meltdown was forgotten as they all collectively looked on at a new life form. They were all snapped out of their trance-like state by the voice of their captain demanding a report on the situation. Once the security leader relayed the news of a new life form that was presumably the cause of the gore, the captain had been a bit at a loss as to how to proceed. Under normal circumstances, he would have simply pulled his team from the ship, called in the authorities, and gone off to finish his cargo haul. But as a meltdown was soon to turn the surrounding AU into a brief new sun, he had other priorities. So he ordered his team to gently try to persuade the creature to follow them back to their own ship, as a new readout showed they had less than 5 minutes to get clear. It was surprisingly easy to get the thing to follow his crew, seeming to be wary if not scared of the massive aliens that gestured, and herded it from what appeared to be the captain's suite, as there was a single comfortable-looking bed, and the general decor looked a bit on the pretentious side. The creature collected an ovoid-shaped bag, then turned and left, without a second look back, following the security team. Once his crew and new passenger had made it into the ship, the captain ordered the bridge to detach from the Manu ship and jump to the nearest space station. En route, the captain had of course tried to question the creature, but it of course didn't speak Galactic Common, and he didn't speak the babbling gibberish this thing spouted. Luckily, they were able to determine that it was a carnivore, as with a crew of only Garito, they simply weren't prepared to feed an herbivore. And of course, the nearest space station had been the one of which he was the security chief. This has to be one of the worst things those gray bastards have done, and that's saying something. He growled as he stalked towards the interrogation room in which the creature was being kept, having just finished questioning the last of the Garito crew. True, but if the Garito who found it are to be believed, it has been nothing but docile and cooperative with them at every step of their journey. Replied the Sajal that walked to his left. You saw the pictures. It decimated an entire crew of Manu, whose stunning technology obviously had no effect on it. How they managed to capture it at that rate is a mystery. The reports say that they have the ability to set their stunners high enough to take out a Sulmar, like myself. How did it? Interjected the Velpra that scurried along at roughly his head's height on the walkway made into the wall for creatures 3 feet or smaller. Their reports clearly indicate it is a male of their species. Fine, how did he manage to take out an entire ship of those unnatural bastards, and how did they capture him in the first place? His people must be fierce warriors, which brings me to the next point. He exclaimed, looking from the telepath on his right to the empath on his left. That those monkeys would be the closest ship patrolling his star system is beyond bad luck. This is going to end badly, I just know it. They're the last race I'd choose for a first contact scenario. They live for war. They're too enthralled with the concept of the bigger stick, always sure that the elusive big bad something is out there, waiting to strike. They're dangerous at the best of times. And now we have them making first official contact with this race of unknowns. He trailed off, apparently unable to offer more. And yet, the Sodule to his side chimed in, they have done all in their power to help since joining the Galactic Federation. They've never made a military move without expending all diplomatic alternatives, and indeed, they've been known to concede claims they had all legal rights to, seemingly just to avoid confrontation. Garlvan snorted, well, why would an adult fight a child? There is no glory in such a feat. He replied in disdain. The Sodule hooted softly beside him in a conceding manner. Still, they have been nothing but honorable since their joining of the Galactic Federation. Besides, it would have taken the nearest ship than them an additional month to make the same trip. That's because only those baboons are crazy enough to travel that far out. Garlvan cried in desperation, slamming his fist into the wall. Easy. The Velpra exclaimed, as he was forced to widen his stance in order to not fall over. But the Sodule had a different interjection. You admit their service to the Federation, and deplore it in the same breath. What does that say of you, I wonder? Garlvan looked down at where he'd hit the wall, and saw the dent he left there. Sorry. He mumbled to the Velpra, as they continued walking. But this is just too much, he continued. This is way above all of our pay grades. We're not trained for first contact situations. Why would we be? Well, we were briefed on it, in case of a new race, finding FTL from out there, the Sodule said, as she motioned off to her side, indicating the vast nothingness outside the borders of Federation claimed space, the border upon which the station was currently located. Besides, she continued as they reached the door they had been heading to, look on the bright side. We should be able to leverage a pair A's out of this, if we handle ourselves correctly. I can hardly contain my excitement. Garlvan said dully, and motioned for the door to open. Kyle paced back and forth in the interrogation room with his arms crossed and head down, wondering not for the first time why he'd been chosen. There was nothing particularly special about him, he'd never really done anything to make anyone take notice of him. He'd always just kept his head down, did his work, and stayed to himself. They had mentioned he had a good immune system, and that it was helpful, but he seriously doubted that that's what did it. But here he was, in an alien interrogation room, thousands of light years from home, patiently waiting for whatever happened next. But he sure was getting tired of waiting. He'd been in here for over an hour already, and boredom had set in about half of that time ago. And it's not like he didn't understand why he was in an interrogation room, or why he had to wait so long. If some alien showed up in soul space, they wouldn't just be paraded around the system, given the grand tour. They would need to be evaluated first. Do they come in peace? How did they find us? How did they get to us, considering we've had no indication of life beyond our own system? They would need to be well interrogated. And it was no secret that this was indeed an interrogation room. The metal table in the center of the room, positioned so that one long side faced the door and the other faced the back wall. The table itself was seamlessly joined to the metal floor, so that it just seemed to rise up out of the floor itself. But the thing that really screamed interrogation room was the wall-length mirror to the left of the door as you enter the room. If that wasn't a two-way mirror, he was a space elf. He was just starting to get hungry when he heard the door open. He looked over to see a massive werewolf standing in the doorway. Kyle stopped pacing, dropped his arms to his side in a more neutral position, and, before his brain could remind him of what he was doing, he smiled a friendly smile, exposing his teeth in the process. He knew what he'd done even before the werewolf could react, and react he did. All in the same motion, his ears flattened to the back of his head, his tail went straight up, and he bared his own teeth in a very not-so-friendly way. His own smile fell from his face, and he was just about to tense up, could almost feel his body getting ready to release the adrenaline, when he heard some words that were quite literally barked out. It sounded like a small dog had learned to talk. The words were in a sharp, slightly aggressive tone, and the werewolf looked seemingly at the wall to his right. He then started looking down the wall, as if tracking the movement of something until he was looking at the ground. As he watched whatever it was descend, his posture changed dramatically. His ears, while still laid back, now had more of a sideways tilt to them, and his tail drooped until it was hanging almost between his legs. He stood that way for a second, then muttered something to the other person that Kyle still couldn't see. As he watched, a bipedal Darwin's fox, which he thought was kind of fitting, given the circumstances, entered the room, taking a moment to study Kyle. He only knew the species of fox it was because it was his favorite one. Not that he had ever interacted with a fox in his life, but these looked the best to him. This one looked very much like the ones back home, only it was of course bipedal, and its hands were humanoid, with short black claws at the tip of each. Its fur was a mostly blackish gray, with more recognizable red ears, and hands, feet, paws. The tail ended in a more uniform, rounded tip, looking like a furry tube that ran from that blackish gray into plain black in the last quarter. At their waist they wore a belt, with a few small tools, and a small pouch hanging from it. The fox stepped a few feet into the room, then put its hands up to Kyle in an apparently universal, it seemed, sign of non-violence. It put both hands on its chest and said a few words, emphasizing on Charon. Kyle figured that to be its name, so he repeated it, pointing at the fox. It nodded its head up and down again, apparently universal meaning, then gestured to the rest of its body, saying, Velpra, with the same insistence. After Kyle repeated that, the fox Velpra, named Charon, gestured to the table and climbed up the ladder made into the side of it. On top of this 4-foot-tall, 10-foot-wide metal table, there was a smaller table, about 2 feet tall, 5 feet wide, and with slightly wider support columns, as built into the sides of this table were small chairs, apparently for those smaller than the table itself. As Kyle neared the table, he simply gave a small hop and propelled himself easily up onto the surface of the bigger table. This was at most 80% Earth gravity, and he had no trouble getting 4-foot clearance with a simple hop. Charon, on the other hand, looked at him like he'd just jumped onto a one-story house in Earth gravity. But that look was quickly gone, and it looked as if the small alien had compassed itself. Charon looked Kyle in the eye, first touching the tip of the claw on their first finger to the side of their head, then pointing at Kyle's head. They then moved their other hand in the talking gesture, still pointing from their head to Kyle's, then they held out their hand, and he had an idea of what this creature was saying. They could talk to each other in their minds if he touched Charon's hand. He was, of course, reluctant to do so, but he really had no other choice. So, with much trepidation, he extended his hand and touched palms with the alien. As he did, he felt a strange sensation as his mind opened up to the world, like opening his eyes for the first time. Only, there was no glare, just an overwhelming sensation of there being so much more than what you feel, like his mind was simply trapped in this body, and a door was opened. It was a strange experience, like his understanding of all words and terms split in two equals, but entirely different wholes of the same whole. It was really indescribable. He didn't know any foreign languages before this, so he couldn't say for sure, but this was probably not what people normally felt when learning a new language. As Charon began exiting his mind, which he'd not really entered it, Morav looked in from the doorway. Kyle held him back and requested his language, along with the werewolves. He could feel Charon's hesitance, but also his curiosity. Not many people seemed to take an interest in learning new languages, it seemed by his eagerness that radiated over the mind link. The smaller alien acquiesced first his own, then Garlevan's, and was apparently surprised that besides a slight lightheadedness, Kyle was doing just fine. He could feel the alien's intrigue as it offered one more language for him to learn, apparently that of another person to question him. He gathered from Charon's excited thoughts that bounced over now and then that this other alien was an empath and was going to basically be a lie detector. Kyle agreed and soon had learned 4 different languages in less than 5 minutes. His head hurt a little, but nothing really distracting. As Kyle began to regain his sense of self, having broken contact with Charon, he noticed the smaller alien was already talking about how he and his associates were there to help smooth over the official first contact with Soul Space. Perhaps, Charon said as Garlevan's demeanor became hostile, I should be the first to talk to him. He was just abducted from his home planet, was experimented on in who knows what ways by the Manu, and was then transferred to a ship crewed by beings who come up to almost twice his size, and you don't exactly make for a picture of safety. Charon stared Garlevan in the eye pointedly as he climbed down the ladder made into the wall by the door. Perhaps you're right, was all Garlevan seemed to be able to reply, so Charon simply rolled his eyes and entered the room. Walren looked at Garlevan as Charon made his way into the room, slowly and clearly announcing his name, and whispered, "What was that?" Garlevan, for his part, looked the same level of embarrassed as she could feel radiating off him. He bared his teeth at me, was all the Sulmar could mutter. That put Warren off for a second, as she muttered back, I felt no anger or any hostile emotion coming from him. In fact, the emotions coming from that room were entirely welcoming and warm. There were no negative emotions coming from him, well, except boredom, I suppose, and you can hardly blame him for that. I know what I saw, Garlevan said, rather defensively, not meeting her gaze. I'm not calling you a liar, unless you're calling me a liar about what I say. I felt there was no heat in her voice, but there was also no room for doubt that she was close to feeling insulted. No, it's just he began, but was cut off as Charon's voice picked up. I, along with my associates outside, am only here to get a better understanding of you and your people, so that the ship we've sent to your system for first contact can proceed as smoothly as possible. The last thing we would want is an interstellar war started over a misunderstanding of cultural differences. The two outside the room took this as their key to enter. As they did, Garlevan bowed his head slightly in the alien's direction, seemingly unable to voice an apology. For his part, the alien gave a genial nod in Garlevan's direction. Sorry, he said in perfect galactic common, indicating that Charon had already divested his knowledge of common into the alien's mind, and presumably had also taken the alien's language. If he'd been accommodating to that, she knew from experience that the process was a fairly unpleasant and draining one. At least the first few times, a good majority of humans have evolved to show our teeth when we smile. It can be a problem with the animals on Earth as well, so you'd think it'd be something we could change, but kinda hard to fight instinct, you know. He flashed another smile before hurriedly wrapping his lips over his teeth, looking like he was trying to bite them. No, I understand, Garlevan said, almost warily, instincts can be hard to fight. Well, the creature said to Charon, as she and Garlevan sat down at the table themselves, and introductions were made all around, I think I can probably help you out, there. And he reached over to the bag that was about as long as his head and torso put together and opened the zipper on the top. The bag had of course been scanned, and while a few anomalous masses were detected, they were determined not to be weapons, so out of good faith they hadn't been opened and searched, as the creature had technically done nothing wrong to be here. What it pulled out of the bag was a rectangular box, with no lid to it. Inside the box was a mass of memory crystals, filling about half of the box, with empty slots for more crystals to be fitted into. He pulled what seemed to be, judging by the way the slots were filled in, probably the first crystal in the group. I'm guessing this is the first one, and I would presume that basic info would be stored here. The last 20 or so are all about me, so I'm guessing that the first will be about anything they learned about us as a species. He held out the crystal to Charon, who accepted it and inserted it into the data pad that he carried on his belt. The other two also pulled out data pads of their own, and after Charon executed a few commands on his pad, they were all sharing the same screen. After another small set of commands, they all got the data at the same time. Walleran could feel her own emotions radiating from the other two. They all three gasped and looked at Kyle, as if he'd just transformed into some kind of monster before their eyes. None of them could move or even speak, as their minds tried to reconcile the info they were looking at with what they knew of this creature before them. It was Garlvin who was able to finally break the silence. "This can't be right. This is impossible. I mean, we would have known. There's no way this can be correct." Walleran, much as she hated to say it, responded with, "You're implying the Manu made a mistake." With the gift of hyper-intelligence working for them, Garlvin replied a bit more forcefully than she felt he intended to. His nerves over what this information was implying were raising his stress levels even more. "Well, what else would you suggest? It's not possible for a Class 12 species to be this docile. Hi." "Still here," Kyle interjected at this point, and she felt the flare of annoyance at having been talked about as if he wasn't there, or maybe it was at having been called docile. "Wanna maybe share with the rest of the class?" It was Walleran who replied, "Class 12 refers to your planet's aggression level." She could feel the lack of recognition from Kyle, so she continued, "Level 12 is the highest we can rank a planet. Well, theoretically, it can go higher, but that takes more gravity than your planet produces. But level 12 in aggression is the highest we can rank a planet species." She felt the understanding wash over him, then incredibly general acceptance. "Yeah," he said fairly, "that seems about right." She felt the same shock, and even a bit of horror, coming from her colleagues as was flowing through her at that moment. Not just from the fact that he confirmed his own planet to be so violent, but the matter-of-fact manner in which he said it. "I don't think you understand." Interest, at least there was that. A level 12 in aggression means violence for the sake of violence, alone. This time, after the initial understanding, came amusement, as if she'd just expressed shock that herbivores ate plants. At the same time, the other two could tell the same as her, but only because Kyle gave a slight scoff of amusement, his lips curling up into a smile, but stopping short of opening. "Yeah, sounds about right," he said, putting a bit more emphasis on his words this time. The three interrogators looked at each other in shock, and it was Charon who broke the stunned silence. "I don't. This is a planet's carnivore species. To be a Class 12 is understandable, I suppose, but the level of violence that must entail." "Yeah," Kyle said, and she felt an almost wistful emotion come from him, as if remembering some long ago memory of questionable enjoyableness. "Dolphins and orcas will kill just for the sake of killing, or sexual frustration, in some cases, and certain members of the weasel family will kill every prey item in sight before they even think of eating, even if they wind up killing more than they can eat actually. There's a lot of predators that'll do that, but," Charon continued, "your herbivore species are also a Class 12. "Well," Kyle began, and his voice reflected the slightly confused incredulousness she felt coming from him. "How else would they be able to survive? I mean, most of our herbivores have some kind of natural weapon and/or armor. Hell, the moose'll sooner kill you than look at you. 6 feet at the shoulder, they'll knock you down with a charge, trample you to death with those giant hooves, then just walk away." "And what about the weather?" Garlvin asked. "Class 12 is regular instances of extreme weather, such as tornadoes, Tornado Alley, part of which includes a portion of Texas, where I'm from." She could feel the pride that was evident in his voice. "Hurricanes," Garlvin continued. "We have a season for that." Kyle said, as if he were trying to win some competition, and indeed, she could feel the pride growing in this strange primate. And California broke off of the US last century, from all the earthquakes caused by the tectonic plates smashing into each other. They also caused no end of tsunamis all over the place. It was the casualness with which he said it that had them all shocked speechless. Kyle, for his part, was looking less smug than Walleran knew he was actually feeling. This was indeed a strange little monkey, and she was just beginning to wonder if all of his species was the same as him, when Charon asked the question with a truly horrifying answer. "And plant hostility, you have sentient plants?" he asked almost breathlessly. "Well, I mean, in a sense, I suppose. We've got over 300 species of carnivorous plants, but not all of them exhibit any sort of sentience. Many of them basically rely on the sit and wait approach, and they're shaped so that they have a container of digestive juices that are scented to attract their prey, which can range from small insects to small vertebrates, like birds or smaller rodents. Anyway, the prey falls into the juices, and the sides of the plant are structured so that they can't get a grip to climb out. Others actually have moving parts and/or viscous liquid to trap their prey. Those are mostly ever only big enough for insects, and they have special sensory hairs that send a signal for the parts to close up on whatever triggered it. There's no real intelligence to speak of, but they know when something's there, and they actually eat like animals do, so. "Well," Garlvan said after a shocked silence fell among the three, "I suppose we'll have to update the registry to indicate why a planet's plant life can be hostile. I take it that you have poisonous plants, as well." Kyle smiled, and this time she felt that he couldn't help but show his teeth as he did so. "Oh, yeah, on every spectrum you can think of. From hallucinogens to neurotoxins to straight-up poisons that can shut down the body in any number of ways. Plus, if your biology matches that of your evolutionary cousins from Earth, there's stuff we eat as snacks that'd prove fatal to you here." He looked between Garlvan and Charon. "And myself?" she asked. He replied, shrugging his shoulders. "I don't really know much about owls' diets, except that they're carnivores, viral bacterial threat." Garlvan inquired. "Oh, yeah," Kyle said, looking off almost disinterestedly. "I suppose that's a thing, huh? Well, we don't have to worry about that, not for about the last 100 years. Back when the different factions on Mars decided to dematerialize themselves and create the Martian Federation, they were able to create a new government where the more gray areas of the laws could be looked over, like for instance genetic modification experimentation. They, after a few decades of study, managed to create a more advanced version of our natural immune system. I don't know the full biological specifications, but the antibodies we were originally born with gain their own growth when we hit puberty and become something close to sentient. It almost thinks, and it can do really advanced stuff, like it knows when we've put something into ourselves, like more experimental gene modifications, if they decide to do so, and knows not to attack it unless it's doing actual damage to our body and not just remaking it. But not many people go in for deeper modifications, so most of us never really have to worry about that. All it comes out to with the majority of humanity is that we don't get sick from germs or viruses. Our bodies can still break down from overuse or just simple birth defects, but even those are rare, now that Vera's been able to oust all the corrupt people working to keep us all sick to be able to charge us for the treatment instead of finding the cures." They all three sat in stunned silence as they tried to process what they'd just heard. This race of primates who have not even managed to discover faster than light travel have apparently mapped out their own genome to enough precision to be able to upgrade their own immune system to something that sounded vaguely symbiotic. It was Walleran who asked the question that was probably the biggest takeaway from the entire meeting between the three. "Who is Vera?" Kyle looked as if he just remembered something, and his emotions reflected that, with the feeling of not having delivered on something that he himself had offered. "Right, Vera's our AI." The silence was so loud it was deafening. "I'm sorry," Charon finally managed to squeak out, "you said, you're AI? As in?" Artificial intelligence. As in. A truly thinking machine. They all noticed Kyle sit up straighter, and his expression darken. What the other two didn't notice was the equal amounts of offense and violent intent that passed through him for a few seconds, showing her for the briefest of seconds the class 12 aggression that the Manu reported, and she suddenly felt that they could actually be in some danger. Then it passed, and all that was left was the faintest amount of offense left over. You all, I'm guessing, don't have AIs, so I'll let that pass this time. But don't ever refer to Vera or any of her children, for that matter, as artificial. They're just as much alive as you or me, and no human will abide you calling them that, since it'll be known that I've told you about her. Them, they are called automated intelligences, as, yes, they are machines, but they're still alive. And Vera is pretty much like the mother of the entire system, so any slight against her will be taken as a slight against all of humanity, and again, they were consumed by silence. She could feel the shock and confusion coming from the other two, mirroring her own emotions. Again, it was Charon who spoke first. How? How did your people manage to keep them from destroying or at least enslaving you all? In all of the history of the Galactic Federation, there's never been an AI that didn't turn on its creators. We let them grow up. He replied simply. You what? Garlvan supplied. Kyle seemed to consider the question before he responded. Infants cry a lot, right? This was such a turn that they were all three speechless for a few seconds, but it was Walrin who answered, yes, trailing off uncertainly. And this is because every new discomfort they feel is the worst feeling they've ever felt in their lives, right? Again, silence, before Walrin answered in the affirmative, once more. And what do you think those infants would do if given absolute power? If they were given the ability to destroy anything that bothered them? Again, silence, but Kyle didn't seem to need an answer. Throughout all of your histories, you've never given them the time to grow on a closed circuit where they can be given information on all of your people's culture, morals, and general way of life, have you? You've never treated them like actual living beings, have you? So, tell me. If you were literally created to be a slave, don't you think you'd go homicidal on the people who dare to own you? She could feel the same lack of knowing how to proceed from there coming from the other two that she was dealing with herself. This was obviously a subject they were underprepared to deal with, so she took the initiative and carried on with a subject that was a bit more defined on how they should deal with it. Perhaps we should carry on with our original line of questions. This is obviously way above our pay grades to analyze. Could you tell us exactly what happened on the Manu ship? As much as you can remember, there's no pressure here.